Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's ITCC member meeting for November. The agenda for today's call includes a few ITCC member announcements, and then we will dive into our presentation for this month, which is the use of emulation versus simulation in certification, an IT professional's viewpoint. This is being presented by Frederick Suizo Mendler, co-founder and CEO of TrueAbility, as well as Marcus Robertson, co-founder and CTO of TrueAbility. The Innovation Award for 2019 is now open for nominations. The award is open to any individuals or companies in the IT certification industry. ITCC membership is not required, so if you or someone you know at another company is doing something innovative that you feel is deserving of a nomination, feel free to encourage them. More information can be found at itcertcouncil.org/innovation. The submission form is also on that page, and then submissions will be emailed to info@itcertcouncil.org. And if you can mark on your calendar to save the date for our spring ITCC in-person meeting, which will be March 17th, 2019 in Orlando, Florida. Further information will be coming. Some action items from our last in-person meeting. An ITCC project library index has been created. Make sure to look for that link in the upcoming member email. As per the member vote during the in-person meeting, the ITCC has applied for membership to the PCC, the Professional Certification Coalition. Also, the Securing Certifications Task Force next project will focus on industry trends. So if you're interested in joining the conversation, please email info@itcertcouncil.org and we will get you set up to join. Here is a reminder of when our task forces meet. If you are interested in joining any of those task forces, please email info@itcertcouncil.org. Thank you, everyone. And now for our presentation, the use of emulation versus simulation in certification, an IT professional's viewpoint. I will now hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Mr. Suizo. I'm just waiting for the share link to pop up. There we go. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Bristol, can you see that?
Yes, we can.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you very much. We're excited about the opportunity to speak a little bit about the differences in emulation and simulation. I am new to the group. TrueAbility is new to the group. I know that at the last meeting in San Ramon, I think a lot of you probably had the opportunity to meet two of my colleagues, Marcus, who is here with me today, and Graham, who is leading customer conversations with us. So apologies that I didn't get to come out to see you all then, but I do look forward to meeting you all in the near future. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today and speak about this topic. Quick look at our agenda. I just think some quick introductions of the speakers, and then we'll talk about performance-based assessment in IT, which is an important kind of umbrella for simulation and emulation. And then we'll have some open discussion, and I think that it's important for us to have a discussion during this talk. So I'll outline a couple of guidelines here shortly to that end. I think, as I said, you've met Marcus, but I'll let Marcus do a quick introduction here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marcus Robertson, CTO of TrueAbility. My main responsibility here at TrueAbility is the deployment of performance-based examination for our customers. So we manage the engagement, and I manage everything from the provisioning out to the automated scoring, and all the coordination that goes into delivering a performance-based examination.
And I have to laugh. If you all could see us right now, it's now probably in the 40s here in San Antonio. So we're all freezing. Everybody is wearing thick leather jackets in the office with toboggans and gloves. So we're sitting in this presentation literally shivering. For some reason, our heater is not keeping up with the cold, but we'll work on that. So my name is Frederick Suizo Mendler, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of TrueAbility. There's always a question about my nickname, and so I thought as a new member, I'd get that out of the way, because I know people always struggle a little bit about what to call me. Should it be Frederick or should it be Suizo? I do go by Suizo professionally, and the quick story on that is in the late 90s, early 2000s, I lived in Austin, Texas, and we went through the internet bubble there. Obviously, I worked for a technology PR firm that was kind of adding to all the hype, as it were. And I soon found myself laid off, and a colleague, someone that used to work for me, was managing a Tex-Mex restaurant, and they said, "Hey, why don't you come wait tables over here, until you get back on your feet." And at that time in Austin, everybody's laid off. Clyde lives in Austin; he may remember this tumultuous era. And so, I said, all right. And I said, I don't know if I can actually, I'm always worried about dumping food on somebody's lap with that big tray of dishes. And he said, "Look, you got a great personality. I think I can teach you how to take nachos out to a table." So I took this job as a waiter at a Tex-Mex restaurant. And, one of my life ambitions has been to be fluent in Spanish. So anytime there's downtime in the restaurant, most waiters go into the bar and watch SportsCenter on ESPN. But I found it, more enjoyable to hang out in the kitchen with the mostly Mexican cooks who, would teach me some cooking techniques, and we, with my broken Spanish and their broken English, we built quite a relationship. So a particular dish was called enchiladas suizas. It's basically an enchilada with green sauce and sour cream on it. But it didn't get ordered enough that I would recognize it. So I would mess it up pretty frequently. And so the cooks, they started calling me Suiza, just to kind of make fun of me for making that error. And then after about a week or so, I realized that this nickname was going to stick. So I asked them politely in Spanish. I said, "Would you please, if you're going to call me an enchilada, would you please call me the masculine version of the enchilada versus the female version of the enchilada?" So they loved it. They obliged me, and I only worked there for about 3 months. I moved to San Antonio to take a job with Rackspace Hosting in late 2002, and I walked in the door in dress slacks and a button down, and I said, "Hi, I'm Frederick William Mendler IV," and I'm in this startup where folks are wearing flip-flops and t-shirts in a very Hispanic community, and they said, "Nope, that's not it. Do you have a nickname?" And when I told them I had a nickname of an enchilada, they ran with it, and that was in 2002, and it really just kind of propagated, and it's become who I am. So the only person that doesn't call me Suizo is my mom, but everyone else, please feel free. So that's who I am, and I set up to me and everybody in person. So some quick guidelines for the chat today. Please let this be interactive. Interject. So many smart people on one call. I'm definitely not pretending to be the end all be all on this. So anything we can all learn together today would be great. And so this is really not a comprehensive evaluation. This is just based on our research. Based on what we're doing as a company that's been around since 2012 and what we believe. And I think the desired takeaway today is really that you just understand the difference between emulation and simulation, and that you might be able to decide which is best for your program if you're looking forward to using one or the other. Okay, so we first have to talk about performance-based assessment, and performance-based assessment, I like to use this line in the easiest sense. It's showing what you know by doing. And it gets to be a bit more challenging with software and technology, because I think for decades we have the benefit of performance-based assessment in skills like, for example, plumbers and electricians, the military, firemen and first responders. But as more and more jobs move to use software and technology, how do we leverage the benefit of performance-based assessment in 21st century workforce? and particularly with all of us, we're in the IT industry. So how do we get to leverage that? And over the years, there hasn't been a very scalable and efficient way to do that. It's been very expensive. There are some companies that I think have done a great job of that very early on. They did it by dedicating themselves to it, bringing in their own teams and building out proprietary performance-based platforms. You know, for example, Red Hat. I look at Cisco as an example of that as well. There probably are others, but those are just some examples in our space. And you know, with performance-based assessment, you know, the cloud has done a lot to create opportunity here. Just as an example, Marcus and I both come from Rackspace Hosting, as I mentioned, and in that time period, the company was growing over 100% year over year. So our main priority was hiring technical staff, and we really found it challenging to be able to assess who had the skills to do the job, who could bring value quickly for our customers, who had the lowest amount of time in their learning curve. So what we found was that phone screens didn't necessarily work. You know, multiple choice tests were not as effective in determining that. Certifications at the time didn't do a good job of it either. Red Hat certification did. Microsoft certification did not, because at the time it was a, you know, read through a book and then answer questions. It didn't mean they could come actually do the practical components of the job. So what we did was we created some labs internally, and we would bring job candidates in and get them on a keyboard and they say, hey, there's some customer challenges in the software. Please go troubleshoot, solve the problem, and then we'll kind of watch you from back here to see how you do. Well, that worked out really well for us, with the exception is that over time, after we kind of hired out of San Antonio, we started having to hire around the world. We had a lot of sunk costs bringing people into the organization and asking them to perform this assessment to only fail and then send them home. So my point is, it didn't scale. Cloud opened that up, and that's really why TrueAbility was created. Just a little sidebar there. TrueAbility was founded on the fact that we liked the ability to do that assessment, and cloud presented the opportunity to do it at scale at a global level. So that's really what, you know, the value of performance-based assessment is, and emulation and simulation are two you know, really key components to that, and I think viable in our space, in the IT space. So when we think about performance-based assessment, probably we'll get some sort of debate here, I'm sure, on this, but the way we look at it is, you know, we like to use Bloom's taxonomy, right? And this is something that I know all of you are familiar with. But we think about a high fidelity assessment, we think about capturing all of the educational objectives. And by getting someone into an environment where they can actually perform real tasks against real things, then we are obviously achieving much more. So performance is valuable. Well, why is it valuable? It's valuable because we can ensure that the person who's getting certification can actually perform the tasks necessary for that skill or that job. So by testing real skills, right? Also, it eliminates a good amount of testing. You know, what we've learned over the years is that you know, when a multiple choice exam makes it out into the wild, then the cut scores can rise directly. But with performance-based assessment, you know, I like to say that one of the values there is, if someone is cheating, they're learning how to do it, right? I knew there was going to be, in my driver's test, the component of parallel parking my car. Someone told me that. I knew ahead of time, but I was able to practice it and then go perform the task. So I do understand that some people don't want their entire test syllabus, you know, out in the open, and that is something we deal with. But as far as cheating, we can do things with performance-based that kind of help against that. They have to actually know how to do it. And, you know, with the automation and the technology, you can get test variability in a performance-based assessment too. So yes, they may have the same type of question, but we can change pieces of that question in a way that make it different. So, you know, Sarah has 18 red roses, could be Michael has 14 blue bicycles inside of a test item. So it may ask the same thing ultimately, but it can be different, so they don't just have the answer programmed in their head. So all of this obviously increases your certification value. And because we're dealing with platforms now that are automated and computerized, that we achieve some scale. So when we look at fidelity, you know, yes, please.
This is fine. I want to echo what you said. About 6 months ago, we rev new version of our basic MPI. Had been in without any significant grade inflation, which sort of blows my mind. So I just to reiterate the point about the longevity you get on these forms when they're performance-based.
Right. Thanks, Claude. And when we look at the fidelity, and the way I like to explain this is you know, I see emulation here. This is from Judy Hale, who some of you may know, obviously a psychometrician that is involved with performance-based assessment. You know, I like to think of the first one, live observation, as being in the OR with the doctor who is, you know, performing the hip surgery with experts, watching every task and judging them. The second would be, in my mind, you know, bringing in a bunch of patients who have had the hip surgery and looking through, you know, all these patients and checking to see that things were done correctly, if that portfolio of work, right, over time, how have they done? Emulation is, in my mind, a real candidate. I'm sorry, not a candidate, a real patient that, you know, we're performing work on, but we don't have the risk of losing the patient on the table if we make a mistake. And I'll talk more about that as we dig into emulation further in the discussion. Simulation would be a mock-up, or you know, not quite a real patient, but maybe a dummy that has some of the components that a real patient may have, and there's no risk at all there, but it's also not real, and such and so forth. So that's how we look at the fidelity of these things. And so when we think about IT and software, we think about what is scalable, what is possible, what is feasible for us. It's really, you know, more on the lines of 3 and 4 here versus 1 and 2. I mean, we can't sit every single, you know, candidate down and watch them do the work. Not yet. I think I've heard some talk about how we can assess people as they do the job in the real world, and I think that's a really interesting thing to talk about, but not a key point of this discussion. Okay. So I've gathered everyone here today so I could basically read you a Wikipedia page. A simulation is an imitation of the operation of a real-world process or system. The act of simulating something first requires that a model be developed. This model represents the key characteristics, behaviors, and functions of the selected physical or abstract system or process. So not a duck is what I have there with that image on the bottom. So it's not a duck, doesn't walk, it may walk like a duck, talk like a duck in some ways, but it yet is not a duck. And so I positioned some attributes of simulation here, and I've started with cons because I do have a bit more on the con side than I do on the pros, so a little bit out of order here. This is obviously open for debate. Please interject if you have something to add. But it is a mock environment, so this is not the real software. This is something that has been developed to seem like the real software or the real information technology environment. These types of environments tend to be costly to develop. This means that there's usually a company that is building some sort of sim or some sort of simulation. I'm going to skip over the third bullet and go to the fourth because it does take special skill to develop these types of things. We have seen several examples where SMEs can actually create emulated environments, but we have not seen situations where internal SMEs are building simulated environments in the IT space. So that special skill is a barrier. They tend to be somewhat difficult to maintain due to this. And that means that when you create a simulated environment, a lot of the components and the attributes are set. So in order to keep parity with a versioning process of a software, you have to go back and continually update that environment, the simulated environment. The sims tend to be unbreakable. There's a fail-safe in place. And this is partly because there are predefined paths for a candidate. When you are in the exam development process, you are thinking about what you want to ask and what paths the candidate may take. And you're forced to think about all of those particular paths. So you have to create scenarios that allow them to take the wrong path, if you wish for them to do that, or there are some sort of guidelines that push them down the right way if they're working through a particular problem.
Right, and an example of this, a simple example of this would be, think about a simple application like Microsoft Excel. If you're building out a simulation for Microsoft Excel, you don't want to have to go build out in your sim every single feature or functionality that exists in Microsoft Excel. If the test objective is for them to build a pivot table, you're going to build out all the features required for them to build the pivot table. You're also going to build in some distractors so that if they get off path, it will take them off path slightly, but you can't go too far down that rabbit hole. So from a simulation standpoint, you can only go so deep and creating a sim for a real application.
That's right. And then when you're grading that particular thing, you're grading their commands. Are they entering the commands that they need to enter in order that they need to enter them in order to solve the problem? Pardon me. And that's as opposed to solving for an end state, which we'll talk about in emulation. I think Marcus kind of hit on it, but you're limiting access to certain features and functionality in most cases. I think there are some simulators that we could argue don't, right? I think that for certain types of sims, particularly maybe a flight simulator, I think you probably have access to all the features and functionality. But with a certain amount of investment, there are lives at stake. There is a lot of investment in that particular thing. But when we're talking about what we are doing here with building out a software, some particular IT certifications, it may not be feasible to go to that length to build a simulator. Not when there's an alternative method available that could be more cost effective. Well, let's talk about some of the pros of the simulation. So it was a con as well, but the fact that it's unbreakable and fail-safe means that you can keep them alive and keep them going if you want to, and there's no risk of them knocking themselves out of a particular exam for some reason or creating some sort of situation that could terminate the exam. That depends on what your goals are. It's obviously great where costs or risks are high. For example, a nuclear technician, healthcare when we're dealing with illnesses or disease, and we need to simulate that versus putting people at risk. Obviously, aerospace and defense when we're dealing with space or flight or human lives. We don't want our pilots training in a real plane with real people on board. It is also valuable for a vendor-neutral technology certification, and the only example that I have of that is CompTIA. And so, the challenge with CompTIA is that they have to represent a neutral position, which means that they can't have an operating system that runs on Windows or Linux. They have to present theories and methods to the folks that are taking their certifications in a way that is neutral. So they have to create a simulation for everything that they want so that they can maintain that. And that's obviously very difficult and costly versus being able to just go grab something that already exists. Obviously, simulation's been around a bit, but it's more well established, and it's an easy delivery method too via browser. Obviously, Flash has been EOL'd, but with Java and HTML5 and some of these other programs, simulation can be delivered fairly easily versus some of the other potential methods. But the opinion here is that it's overall a costly endeavor. It's somewhat inflexible, and it's a bit lower fidelity. What are some areas of simulation that you folks may think make sense for certifications? Anybody have anything to add there? Wallace, I bet you have something for us.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking that one of the ways that it really makes sense is if you create a model of something that's an abstraction, and then you're not teaching or testing the specifics of how it's done in this particular application, but you're testing whether or not they have the concept. So it's an abstraction, kind of an interesting way to do it.
Right, great, thank you, Wallace. With no other comment there, I will move into the emulator side. Interestingly, when you think about an emulator, the term itself really only came about when computers came out, and it really means an imitation of a program or a device. So it refers to the ability of computers or electronic devices to imitate the existing, the main thing, the host. And in this case, I have the icon here of it is a duck. It walks like a duck. It talks like a duck. It is a duck. Here we start with pros. It's your actual product. It's your actual software. It's your actual technology. All improvements to that product are available. So adding new features. Now look, that could also be a con, right? Well, and I don't think I added it this time, but there's a discussion I think we always end up having, which is how do we control versioning with certifications? That's something that comes up quite a bit. But you're dealing with a complete real-world environment in this particular case, and something that you don't get in the simulation is the ability to solve things differently. And with an emulated environment, you know, I might argue that there's many different ways to solve a problem.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. So the challenge there is that people solve things in a different way. So you want to allow them to solve things in a different way, and then look at the end state. Did they end up solving it, getting it done? And that's maybe more important than the way they solved it. Now, understanding there are some situations where how they solved it matters, and you can grade that in that particular case. But in a simulation, you're pretty stuck on the way that has been developed that you're supposed to solve it. Whereas an emulator, you can actually take your own path. So that means there's no bumpers, there's no gutters. You can break it. There could be questions that are gated. I mean, there's situations inside of a virtual environment that if you do something wrong, you may lock yourself out of the system. You may eliminate the system altogether. You could delete data. There are those risks. You could argue that to have a high value certification, you want them in as real of an environment as possible. So the grading is flexible for that end state and not the path. And, you know, again, having the access to the full features and functionality of software is important.
Right, and I'm gonna pick on Wallace here for a second. So Wallace and I had a good conversation, I believe, last week. It was kind of it ended up being a simulation versus emulation conversation. We were talking about the crane operators and some new things they're doing on their examinations. So there was a sim, or virtual reality sim, that got presented regarding the crane operators and how they test and how they get certified. One of the pieces of feedback was, well, in an emulator, which means when I'm in a real crane and I'm just dropping the balls into the bucket, Wallace called it, there's this pucker factor. There's this factor of it's real world. I could really cause damage with this crane. So you're a little bit more tense, and you're a little bit more focused, and what you're doing, the actions you're taking are a little bit more intense. When you're in a simulator in a virtual reality environment, you lose that pucker factor. You lose that intensity because you know this is virtual. You know there's nothing I can do to really break anything, harm anyone, or damage this crane. So there is a big difference there between real world being emulated and versus sims.
Some of the cons. The software technology update cycle can drive a lot of changes. You know, this means how to, again, back to versioning. But the neat part about that is that in many ways you can automate that so that the exam is frequent, is updated frequently. In many ways, you don't get a lot of broken test items when there is an update. But those things can be worked through. But that is one of the things you need to know about. And then, of course, internet connectivity and latency. When you're dealing with an emulation and you're dealing with someone working on, you know, in a live environment, there's internet connectivity that can cause problems. You have to be aware of that. And then, you know, it's not just running locally inside of a browser, right? And then item writing requires both the question and understanding the end state. So you have to write to the end state. What is it that we want this to look like when it's done? That can be a con if it's an unfamiliar methodology. So I think, you know, emulations really allow, you know, test administrators to evaluate technical skill more accurately than other available mechanisms, for the simple reason that they replicate real world environments with 100% accuracy in real time. What are some areas where you guys think that emulation may make sense for certification?
I think the other thing that helps with the emulation is if you've got multiple factors in your environment. I got multiple switches that I need to connect to. You know, your simulators get more and more complex as you add in components. Whereas an emulated environment, it is like the real environment. It does get more bandwidth, but you don't necessarily are building more simulation.
Thank you. when I think about the 20, some of the jobs out there, one of the ones that we get asked a lot about are data scientists. And I always say, how do you know a data scientist can data science, right? I mean, these are new, in the world of technology, there's so many new careers and new jobs coming out and things are moving very quickly. But these new skills, how do we know people could do them? And I say the only way to do that is if we're able to put them inside of a real environment, doing the tasks that we need them to do and then measuring the output of that. Our co-founder says this. I thought I'd kind of conclude with this. If the product is software, the product should always be used for certification. If the product is a physical thing, you use simulation because it's either unwieldy or expensive or difficult to obtain the real product. But in all cases, using the real product would be better. And I think at this point, let's talk about it. Clyde, I know you've got a lot of experience here. We'd love to hear your input.
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges and I'm curious to kind of get feedback from this group, I think we have a pretty diverse set of folks on the call here, is how do you go from, it's the change management piece, right? Getting people to go from a traditional type exam to a performance-based emulated or even simulated exam. And part of that, I think there's this perception that it is harder to pass. Do you guys hear that? Do you address that? And that seems to be something that, and I'll let other folks weigh in, but that seems to be one of the things I hear is this perceived mountain to climb on difficulty when you move away from a defined response.
Well, Clyde, this is Wallace. I've heard that on occasion, and interestingly, it's usually interspersed with something like, yes, it's harder, but I realize that that's what I need to be able to do. In other words, often the candidate will recognize this is tougher, but it's the real deal, and they should be able to do it. So even if it doesn't get the same passing percent, it certainly has a lot of authenticity.
Right. Yeah, I mean, without naming names, we're talking to a potential partner in one of the Asian countries, and it's a really interesting dynamic, kind of this cognitive dissonance, because on the one hand, they're complaining bitterly about how often they have to rev their forms for their existing exams, and it drives them crazy because basically it's constant revving because the answers are getting put on the cheat sites pretty much the same day. But that's coupled with this reluctance to pull the trigger and move. Our program was lucky in that sense that it was a brand new program, right? So we didn't have the change management element of trying to move folks over. Anybody else on the call right now thinking about, in process of making a move and insights about how to handle that, the change management aspect with the community?
So this is Janet, and yes, HPE is we are moving forward and pretty determined to do some performance testing. And I mean, we're still at I don't know, step 1 or step 2. So the change management is going to have to get built in there. But our candidates, especially, our higher level candidates, they've been asking for the performance-based testing because it has so much more credibility. So I don't think, you just have to set your expectations properly, and the partners who have to plan and they have to meet deadlines, to me that will be our political issue, because if they don't have the skill, they're going to fail and it's going to take longer and they have to prepare better. And so I think we'll face that from a program perspective, but we'll get there.
This is Claudia Needham from VMware. So I just have a question of, how do you begin to make that change? What are the things that you need to think about, or how do you dip your toe in? What's that process look like? And a second question, that kind of flows from that is, how does the exam development process change? We're used to running IDWs. You bring a bunch of SMEs together, they write the questions, we technically review them. I'm assuming you still do that sort of thing. Do you still create your blueprint? But how different does your blueprint look from a traditional, computer-based exam? That was 3 questions, I'm sorry.
Claudia, this is Wallace. One thing is you actually typically have 2 blueprints. One is public and it's basic topics. And the private blueprint that you keep with your item writers are, what are the tasks that we're going to ask? Because you don't want to release those tasks publicly. So you actually have this dual development of your blueprint.
And just to piggyback off that, this is Clyde from the Linux Foundation. We iterated a lot, and what we ended up landing on was, and Wallace would say he told us to, because he did, is doing the entire thing in person. So we now convene a 4-day in-person workshop, and we spend the first 2 days defining the scope and the domains and the tasks, private blueprint, the public blueprint. But then days 3 and 4, we keep them on site and we actually write the exams, because writing a performance-based exam, a question to go into an emulated and live type environment is such a different thing than writing a, constructive response type. And what we, as we kept iterating through, we finally realized, okay, what we have to do is lock them in a room so they can be together, give everybody access to their own sandbox, right? That is basically your best guess as to what the exam environment is going to be, and make them try the question as they go. And it means that the first 1 or 2 questions, because we do it in waves, it takes insanely long. They're just trying to get their arms around, what is this and how do I, then I have to try it to make sure it works. And so there's this really steep learning curve where the first, I would say 2 items that everybody writes takes, hours and hours and hours. And then they sort of get the feel of it. And and what that means is it does, it definitely makes it more expensive to run the session, both in terms of time and dollars. And, it is tricky, right? You're asking 12 people to step out of their jobs for a week.
Yes,
And, trying to spread it out and try to do it virtually, we found it doesn't work. There's just so much.
So on site with them all in one room is better than trying to do this remotely.
That's what we found, in a room, and then you give each of them access to the sandbox so they can try it out themselves.
Yeah, that just, I think we all know that you get better quality even for constructive response items. You get better quality items when you've got them all in a room for 4.5 days as well. So,
right.
That
now,
makes more
I don't know,
sense.
Jared, maybe you can answer the first part of the question around how you sort of prepare people other than give them plenty of notice.
Was that me, Clyde?
I was just asking, if you guys had started off communication process. I think the first part of Claudia's question was around, how do you begin pushing the stone up the hill?
Oh, well, well, for ours, our starting point is actually a technology issue, because we're trying to access hardware, not software, and so we're still putting the pieces of the puzzle together to do that, and we're making some really good progress. And so once we do, and keep in mind that Aruba has performance tests where people actually come they fly in and they work on real hardware in the room with a live proctor in the classroom. And so they kind of have a working model, and they don't do an IDW. When we integrated Aruba, they already had performance exams where they just developed their own exams. So the first step is to have them access remote hardware from the classroom. And then the second step is, okay, how do we do that with online proctoring? And then we'll figure out how to do a real IDW and things like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're trying to scale what is already happening in a unscalable model.
Right.
Jedi, did you guys move any of the Dell exams from constructive response yet?
Yeah, we actually launched our first simulated one this year. So, and you know, there's some reasons behind that. A big factor was the one, we are simulating hardware, right, or the hardware front end, or the front end to the hardware, and then also the bandwidth issue, right? We've got a lot of locations where we got people taking exams in very low latent or high latency, low bandwidth areas, and so that was a pretty critical element for us. Kind of going with the simulation versus emulation. I think it does kind of depend on what you're doing too. To your point, the point earlier.
Was that an exam that you switched from a constructive response to, or was it a brand new exam? I'm trying to get to that whole communication point of how you notify the audience.
So we did it as a new exam, and the other ones we have piloted or we have targeted would be new exams or major revs, right? So to where it's a significant, not an update, just a simple update to an existing.
And is it largely the same audience that took your existing exams that you're expecting to take?
Yeah, so it'll be a lot of the same audience, and they're actually really excited about it when they're taking that performance-based. Got a lot of good feedback on taking that versus the constructive responses.
Clyde, if the background with Red Hat is that they actually had a written exam that took an hour and a half, and then did a hands-on exam for an hour, and they ran them both simultaneously for a good while, and then we did an analysis as to what factors were most important, and they ended up deleting the written exam. So you know, people might consider administering both for a period and then conducting a psychometric analysis and seeing how much variance you get in the multiple choice versus the performance exam.
So along those lines, and that's another thing, we actually, with ours, we actually did it as a two-parter, where it actually has some constructed response and some simulation.
And one of the reasons we did it with the new exam was because of fairness. We didn't want to have people who had taken an exam that was purely traditional and then one which was performance-based. It didn't seem fair to do that, so that's why we started out with net new.
I'm just looking down the attendee list. I don't see anybody from NI on. I know they've got emulated systems on. Does anybody else on the call have experience with either emulation or simulation?
So this is Carrie from VMware. We have a lab-based exam that's delivered within our local environment, but it has a lot of bandwidth issues because you can't control that at the test centers. I'm really interested to hear anybody's experience with delivering through remote proctoring, so you're putting that bandwidth requirement on the candidate. Anyone?
Yeah, this is Clyde. So we've been doing that now, I don't know, years. And it isn't as much. I think our spec for the candidate, both of them, to have 300K up. They don't need that much down because you're not pulling that much. But what we haven't found to be too much of an issue, even for candidates testing in what you think of as lower bandwidth, higher latency places like India. I think some of the new compression technologies on the screen share side of proctoring make it a lot less. It's a much thinner set of clients now to have both elements, right? The proctoring element and the command line element. We found that works because even when on occasion when we do mass testing, like at an event, that suggested that guideline of 300 kbps seems to hold pretty true. So obviously it depends on your candidate, but for most things anymore, I would consider that to be a relatively low bandwidth requirement.
Okay.
the bigger challenge is trying to locate the hosting of the underlying machines, virtual machines, geographically as close as possible to the candidate, that you're not adding, 200 milliseconds of round the world.
Thank you.
Has anybody on the call considered adding emulation or simulation and decided against it? Either you're on mute or that's a no. I'm just curious.
No, no, we might be using a simulator in a situation if we can't buy enough hardware. Hardware is still going to be our first choice, and a simulator might be our short term. But given the choice, we want real hardware.
Suizo, I'm curious, and Marcus, what are your clients most surprised by when they try to make this transition? Are there themes there that you see in terms of learning that things folks weren't expecting as they start this journey?
Well, the first thing, I guess, from the exam item writing standpoint, the first thing is the first realization is if it's someone that has a existing examination, maybe it's a different form like a multiple choice, they quickly realize that it takes a different type of SME or a different way of thinking to write a performance-based item versus a multiple choice item. I think that's the first thing we typically get on the exam design side. The second one is what everyone's called out here is that latency issue. Now I think we put some things in place to mitigate that, but explaining to them that, hey, have you considered latency issues? Because the first questions that we always get is, why do we have to deploy? We talk about our deployment strategy, how we deploy in 23 days in regions around the world. And the first question we always get is why that's necessary. So we have to explain to them, well, because of the latency issue, you want to get as close as you can to a candidate. And a lot of times that's not thought of when you're thinking about, if you're coming from multiple choice, that's not something you ever even have to consider. So we have to kind of educate them on that process and why that needs to be the case. So probably latency, explaining the concept of latency and why it's going to be different on a performance-based exam versus multiple choice, and explaining the different skill sets needed for your SMEs are probably the two biggest things that pop up when we're talking about transitioning from one form to a performance-based.
Got it. Now, one of the things I hear is I think people have a general understanding that it is more expensive to build this type of test, right? Whether emulation or simulation, than it is to build at the item level a constructive response. Do you guys see any differences between the two, in simulation versus emulation? Are they roughly equivalent? Is one more expensive than the other? Just let folks think about, obviously most certification groups don't have fairly constrained budgets, right? Any patterns there?
Clive, is that directed to the group or to us?
I was asking you guys just as you work with clients.
I don't, let's see, the most of the custom, so what's interesting is that we don't end up having to sell performance-based assessment very often. We're typically, the folks that we're working with understand the value of it and they're looking for ways to do it. And then some percentage of those have also done something internally in some way to get to that result. We have a good handful of customers that actually started out building a performance-based certification program on their own, but then kind of ran into a wall scaling it because they want the program to be bigger, or they're taking it global, or they're missing on the automated grading or something like that. And that's, obviously that's why it becomes more valuable to work with someone like us, because we've created the orchestration, we've got the data center presence, we've got all those things. So, there hasn't been a situation that I can think of what we've worked with somebody who went down the path of simulation outside of CompTIA, who we've had a relationship with for many, many years, but really just because we were trying to find ways to work together, but ultimately just doesn't make sense because of that vendor neutral requirement. And I just think just to kind of give a little bit of thought around this, I do think that, things like TrueAbility and others who do what we do have broken a barrier here. I mean, we've been able to create something that I think was very difficult and expensive, but it still is a bit expensive, right? I mean, it's still something that tends to be more reserved for the enterprise, but ultimately it's our goal that, I think that access to performance-based assessment should be ubiquitous. In order to do that, it's got to be, the price has to come down, and we have to be able to present access to more, to different levels of companies and more people. And so, ultimately the long-term strategy for a company like ours is to figure that out. And so I think that, the last couple of years really just represent a breakthrough of create, democratizing access to performance-based assessment. But now the next mission at hand is how do we bring it to the masses? And so, that's what we are looking forward to over the next, handful of years.
Got it. One question, this is for the group, it picks up on a point that you made, Suizo, that when you're doing a simulation, you pretty much define the path, right? There is a right path, and you're looking for basically the command. Whereas on an emulation, there can be multiple paths, right? That candidates can take to achieve, is basically leave the system in the desired end state. I'm just curious across folks on the call, is the idea of looking only at the end versus the path a positive or a negative? Are there instances? I guess I'm mostly interested whether there are cases where people feel like there is a right way to do stuff, and that having alternative paths to solution would not be attractive.
Clyde, this is Wallace. I think that the typical distinction made in the field is that you evaluate the path if you're doing diagnostics for training. On the other hand, if you're doing certification, you just accept the end state.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody grappled with that concept of the end state versus the path and the sort of quote unquote right way to do it? Or have concerns it might be problem. We weren't concerned about it. So it, I can't comment because it wasn't anything we really thought hard about. I'm just curious.
At Dell EMC, we went with the end state, but we were concerned about it because there are best practices, better ways of doing things. You want people to do it the most efficient way or the proper way, not just get the right result. At the end of the day, we just measured on the right result.
And Clyde, this is Marcus. I'll just give you an example. We have seen some customers, so 99% of our customers in our portfolio all kind of look at end state, although we do have some that apply a point difference based on the path taken. So you'll still get an item marked correctly, but the point value is deducted or added based on a specific or more proper path taken or more efficient path taken to solve a problem.
Oh, cool. I didn't realize you guys did that. All right, I know we're coming up towards the top of the hour here. Any other observations or questions from the group?
Well, great. Well, thank you all for allowing us the opportunity today.
No, I was just going to say, good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. And Bristol, I'm going to hand the chair back to you.
All right, well, thank you, Suizo. Thank you, Marcus, for your presentation. Members, you can look for everything on the presentation will be on the ITCC YouTube channel, and you'll receive an email with that link. If you have any questions, of course, you're always welcome to email info@itcertcouncil.org. Thank you again for your presentation. Everyone have a great Thursday.
Thanks all.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.